In a word, her birth was an accident, and so was her death. This is the No Fear podcast. We know what scares you. I'm Mel.
And I'm Lisa. And this is the No Fear Cast, the podcast where we dissect horror and all the things that scare us. This is episode 24 of season 5, and we are continuing our Summer of Kaiju, this time with the South Korean giant monster film, The Host.
Well, I'm going to start us off here with just a little bit of information about the movie. And then I think I'm going to pitch it to Lisa because, Lisa, you were the one who recommended that we watch this movie. So I kind of want to get your thoughts on it and why it kind of popped into your head we were doing this series. I also want to start off by saying that Matt is not with us tonight, which I'm sure listeners, you noticed because he wasn't at the beginning where we list our names. He's kind of under the weather and wasn't able to join us for the recording. So you get Lisa and Mel for this particular episode. So the movie The Host is a South Korean movie. It came out in 2006. And the writer director of the movie is Bong Joon Ho. And it was also written by, and I am most likely going to mispronounce these names. I apologize ahead of time, but it was also written by Won Joon Ha and Chul Hyun Baek. Bong Joon Ho is probably a familiar name to listeners because he wrote and directed Parasite, which was, well, I think it won 4 Oscars. It was the Oscar winner in 2020 for Best Picture. It was the first foreign language film ever to win that. He won Best Director, the second Asian director to win, Best Original Screenplay, etc. And you may also know him from the movie Snowpiercer, and several actors who are in The Host have also been in other movies that he has directed. So this was my first time watching this movie, and I do want to get into my impressions of it. But first, Lisa, you recommended this to us as a kaiju installment, and I just want to hear from you, like, your thoughts on the movie and why this movie was, why you thought of this movie for the kaiju series.
Okay, well, first of all, I just like this movie, so I wanted to talk about it. But really, as we were putting together our Summer of Kaiju, and I wanted to think of films that might not pop in people's minds right away when they think about kaiju movies, because obviously Godzilla is the first one to come to mind, and we've talked about Godzilla, we've talked about Mothra. I'm sure we're going to talk about, because we've got a couple more episodes in this Summer of Kaiju left to record, we'll still talk about some of those kind of classic Japanese ones that have appeared, especially the ones from Toho Studios. I'm sure we'll talk about more of those. But I wanted to have a variety of different ones, and I'm really pleased with what we've come up with for this Summer of Kaiju, because not only have we done the classic Toho ones, we've done, we did Paul Tremblay's short story, which was kind of an ambiguous kaiju story. We've done Colossal, which was this, kind of indie drama that featured kaiju in a really unique way. And, coming out of that one, I started thinking, what are some other ones that people might not expect, but still fit in the tradition? And that's when I thought about The Host for this one, because number one, it's a little bit of a different tradition than ones we've looked at. So we've looked, at the Japanese, and we've looked at some that came out of the United States. This one is obviously coming out of South Korea. So it has a little bit of a different take on it. And then I started thinking, well, this kind of fits interesting because we've had the discussion several times, and we even did a mini over on our Patreon feed about, is it kaiju? Where we looked at a few different types of things, and we were trying to determine, does it fit? Is it just like a spooky creature, or is it actually a kaiju? Does it fit in that tradition? And I thought of The Host when I was thinking about that, because to me, this one does fit. You have a larger than life creature, truly a giant monster that is terrorizing a city and causing widespread panic and destruction, which, that is one of the criteria of kaiju. But there's also some sort of like greater political implications going on. This particular kaiju is maybe connected to the dumping of some chemicals in the Han River. And so I thought, okay, well, that definitely fits because a lot of the kaiju we've been looking at have dealt with some sort of radiation or pollution or war that has, in some way humans have brought about, either wakening the kaiju from its like deep slumber or growing it from a cute and cuddly creature to something that can, stomp all over a city. And in that way, the host definitely fits. But I also thought this was kind of a standout in the kaiju tradition because this isn't just a kaiju movie. You mentioned Parasite, of course, when we were discussing Bong Joon Ho. And I think this one in particular, out of all of his movies, is a really good. Like, I think it would be so much fun to do a double feature night and watch The Host and then watch Parasite because they share so much thematically. So this obviously is a little bit different in the way it deals with like social structures and what it's saying about society. There's a, well, I'll just say this: this is not a subtle movie. Um, it's really obvious that it's saying a lot about, America, their place in the world and how they interact with the world, but also about like the different, social systems that are going on within South Korea, because the main characters are coming from a working class family. Bong Joon Ho, if you've seen any of his other movies, a lot of his films deal with that. But then there's also this like virus in the movie, so it's also this kind of like contagion film at the same time. So it's this really strange like mismatch of films, but it all works. Like when you watch it, I don't know. I feel like if I was explaining this to somebody and I said, this is a kaiju film that deals with a like a contagion outbreak, almost like apocalypse, but there's also searing satire look at like social systems and how the Americans deal with the rest of the world, and particularly South Korea. And there's also like really funny parts. It's a comedy too, in a way that works with everything else. I don't know. That does not sound like a great movie to me, but for some reason, it really works with the host. So, yeah, for all those reasons, I thought, okay, we've got to talk about this. I mean, at the very least, there is a kaiju monster in it. There's a lot more, but there is a kaiju monster in it. So we've got to talk about it. I am really curious, Mel, since this is your first time watching it and I did subject you to it. I'm curious to get your thoughts on it.
I love that choice of word that you subjected me to it. I feel like I this is my first movie of his that I've watched, but I feel like it was on my radar before this. I'm wondering if I saw it in a list of like monster movies or kaiju movies or something at some point and kind of filed it away in the back of my mind. But I had never sat down and watched it. To me, and I am no, one thing I think you were talking about this too, Lisa, but like I'm not an expert on South Korean film or even like the culture. I'm sure there were things in this movie that I'm sure went over my head, and there are things I'm sure we won't be able to address. But one thing I thought of when you first told us we should watch this movie is I was like, oh, this is a South Korean movie, which is interesting to me as a person who enjoys kaiju because, of course, in the 60s, there was a South Korean kaiju movie, Yongari, which I believe is it's in the new, it's one of the movies in the new Netflix Mystery Science Theater series. And there have been more movies with Yongari over the years, I think in the 90s and maybe even the early 2000s. So there's kind of like, in an interesting way, I feel like, even though I don't know how much of an influence that would have been on the host, but there is this background of monster movie, kaiju movies in South Korea. And I thought that was interesting because, we've talked a bit about like links between different things. And I'm wondering, like, Yongri was supposed to kind of compete with Godzilla. And so it's just an interesting history there. The host, I have to admit, in my mind, I went back and forth as to whether it's just a creature feature or monster movie or if it's kaiju. I think that you made a compelling I can't believe I'm saying this seriously, but I believe that you made a compelling argument, Lisa, that is a kaiju movie. It's a giant monster that was awakened or created by man, because you have we start out in the morgue at a U.S. military base in South Korea, and the American tells his Korean assistant to pour all this formaldehyde down the drain. And even though he knows that this is going to pollute the drinking water, he's just like, oh, maybe it will, maybe it won't, kind of. I mean, he talks about how the river's really broad, so this will be like a drop in the bucket, but it's a lot of chemicals. And then you kind of get really quick montage that the fish are dying and the animal life in the river is changing. And then, of course, you have this monster, which I believe the Korean title of the movie just translates closest to The Monster, but it ended up getting titled The Host, which I guess has something to do with the virus aspect of the movie. I'm not sure. But yeah, you're right. It's like got so many genres, like from contagion to apocalypse to creature feature to kaiju. It doesn't destroy the city as much as, say, like Godzilla would, but it definitely destroys parts of the city, and it definitely uh, preys upon the people in the city. I mean, the movie begins, interestingly enough, with the monster coming out and attacking everybody. It's probably the earliest showing of a creature I've seen in a movie like this, maybe ever. And it kidnaps the child of this working class family, the Park family that you described, Lisa, and they kind of go on this mission, the family themselves, to try to rescue her. So yeah, I think you could call it a kaiju. It's a giant monster, has something to do with like pollution and political issues going on in a country, destroys parts of it, it hurts people's preying upon them. And it also, like you said, is talking about a lot of political and cultural aspects as well. Class is a big deal. I also thought it was interesting that biological warfare was involved as well, because the tools that the U.S. military and South Korean counterparts use hurt the people as much as anyone else. They basically use this poison gas that ends up being just as detrimental to humans as it may be to the monster, which was terrifying. And so you definitely have this connection, not just to pollution, but also to aspects of war. It also kind of skewers the media. I mean, there's so many layers of things getting skewered in this movie that it's kind of hard to almost keep track of it all. The comedy, I think, in the movie was effective, but sometimes it would veer so quickly between comedy and drama and comedy and horror that it was like I felt like I was kind of being pulled in different directions, which I think also helps with like the making you feel like the defamiliarization of it and like the confusion of the characters themselves, because no one ever knows what's going on. And I think before we get into more discussion, I had one more point that I was thinking of while I was watching it, and that is the fact that you really see this. I think the movie does a really good job of showing that the monster is the danger, but like it seems like the people in charge, kind of, in the political like state apparatus, are also can be the monster as well, because that was what created it in a way. And that is also, we find out in the course of the movie that there was no virus, that the people were being fed this to kind of keep them away so that they could figure out what to do about the monster. Like, there's deliberate misinformation and misleading, there's actual confusion, and he paints a really good picture, a terrifying picture, in fact, of the disconnect between government and media and people who are in charge, and the way they want to control narratives, and the poor regular people who are just trying to survive. Like when the father is basically they find out that he knows too much, and they're like saying that he's crazy and they're going to give him a lobotomy. I mean, it goes to extremes. so he can't go rescue his daughter. They're like, well, why didn't you just tell someone who had some power and they could have helped you rescue your daughter? Like they list off like 20 different people you could have talked to, from like medical people to police to basically like the equivalent of the Red Cross or whatever. And he says, quote, my word, they cut him off at one point while he's trying to explain the situation. He says, my words are words too. And I thought that was so powerful, because you have the people in power who aren't listening to anything that's being said by anyone else, and there's a lot of damage that comes to the regular people from the powers that be, that's not even related to the monster, if that makes sense. And I thought that was interesting, this idea that no one listens and no one helps. In fact, it's the regular characters that defeat the monster at the end, because no one would help them. In fact, the gas, like I said, is hurting them. So it was kind of terrifying, because it's like they're going through this apocalypse, whether it's a real monster or a virus or someone attacking or something, and nobody who's supposed to be in control or knowledgeable about the situation is actually helping anyone else. And I found that to be just as scary as the monster that's running around eating people. Does that make sense?
No, it completely does. And that scene you were referencing towards the end, when, because it is heartbreaking, I think, because at the core of this movie, it is really about a father trying to rescue his daughter. Like that is really, just when you boil down this really complicated movie, that's what it's about. And it's really touching in that, because you can tell from the very beginning that despite everything that this family is, like, everything that they're going through, everything that they kind of have stacked against them, they all want to take care of this little girl. She's a middle schooler in the movie, Hyun So, and she that is just that is the impetus of like everything that the family does, is they're just trying to get to her, because in a really horrific scene, and you're right, it does happen so early on. Just as a little side note, this is one of the coolest, I think, monsters I've seen in any like creature features or kaiju, only because when we first see it, it's like hanging by its tail under the bridge. And the way it can, I mean, it moves very fast for a large creature. It runs and gallops on land, but to watch it dive, which it does several times through the movie, like dive into the water and swim, is fascinating. It's a really cool monster design, I think. But when it first emerges and it's attacking everybody and it grabs the little girl, it kind of has wrapped, it doesn't eat her right away. It wraps its tail around her and pulls her into the river, which is terrifying enough, because you're watching it happen and you're thinking, oh my God, and this monster has her. But you find out that she's still alive, because it's dropping or a lot of the victims, it's dropping into this like part of the sewer, and is keeping them there, almost like a little prison in the sewer, just, I guess for when it gets hungry, it has little snacks. So I just wanted to like kind of point that out. But yeah, at the heart of it, there is just this like familial love for this little girl, and they're just wanting to protect her and make sure she's safe. So it becomes really heartbreaking and frustrating as the audience members to watch how helpless the family is really to get help. Because you're right, throughout the course of the movie, they never get the help that they need to go find her, and they end up doing everything on their own, and they're having to use their resources that they have, which of course are limited, and they have to use their money and assets, which again are limited, and their connections, which are limited, and they end up just basically trying to do this elaborate operation to go get her when they're completely unprepared to do that. And that's where some of the like comedy comes from a little bit. just because you're watching people who don't really know what they're doing try to pull off, what is the equivalent of like a spy movie mission. But it's really fascinating to watch. And that scene where he said, my words are words too, really was heartbreaking, because you could feel that had been coming his entire life. Because throughout the course of the movie, you learn more about the family dynamics and how, as a child, he was really kind of ignored and neglected by his own father, even though that seems to have changed now that they're adults. He's raising this child on his own because the mother left. There's a sense that it was probably like a teenage pregnancy type of situation. And then he's got his adult siblings who have each gone on to achieve some level of like success, more than he could. One is a college graduate, the other is a bronze medalist, we find out in archery. And they belittle him and, kind of treat him like he's kind of the dumb one in the family, or the loser in the family, or he's not as smart as they are, he's not as educated as they are, he's not as accomplished, and he's just kind of generally the screw up of the family. And so even within his own family, he can't find what he needs. And he did try to talk to the doctors, and he did try to talk to the police, the people that he could find, to tell them that his daughter was still alive and that she had called him on the phone, and was immediately dismissed. And I found that really, really kind of heartbreaking. And so that scene in particular, where he says that, on one hand, you were kind of cheering for him because you want him to be able to kind of say, no, you have to listen to me. But at the same time, it comes from a place of real heartbreak. So yeah, I mean, that's another reason I love this movie and a lot of his movies, is that there usually is a real heart to them. And even though the characters are complicated and they're all very flawed, they're still somebody you're rooting for. And yeah, I really enjoyed that. And you're right. We've got to talk about like the bigger monster here, because there's the kaiju. But when you really look at how many people the kaiju took down in comparison to what is happening around that, I feel like the monster did a lot less damage than the humans did in this film, because there's questions about whether or not the illness is actually real, like the virus is actually real. We find out later that the person that they thought had identified the virus, they thought they were reporting had died of the virus, actually died on the operating table. So they have no evidence of any virus at some point, but it's almost like they've shut everything down and quarantined everything, so they can't just come out and say that they don't have a virus. And then they're convinced, maybe through their own like hubris, that the main character thinks it's in his brain, because they think he's showing signs of dementia, which clearly he's not. And they're basing that all on the fact that he thinks his daughter's still alive. Even though they say, well, your daughter can't be alive. Several times this is said throughout the movie, that the daughter can't be alive because she's on the list of the deceased. So there's this running theme throughout that, like, once the official report comes out on something, it can't ever be contradicted. So if the government or the news or media or whatever reports that there's a virus, then by default there's a virus, even if they don't have any evidence for it. Or if they say, well, she's on the list of the deceased, then she must be deceased, even though there's evidence to show that she's alive. They have the phone records, but nobody will look at the phone records. Nobody will follow up on anything. And that is what I find so fascinating.
Yeah, it's like the people who are in charge range from practically evil because they put the poison in the drinking water that creates the creature to incompetent, like you're saying, like getting things wrong or thinking they can't change the story. And they're definitely apathetic because they don't care about what's going on. Like you said, he talks to several people and they don't seem to care. I kind of got the impression that the reason they said the virus was in his brain was because they wanted him to be quiet because I don't know, it felt more like they were trying to silence him than or put him out of the way of everything since he had touched the monster because that was a big thing if you had been near the monster. Maybe I'm wrong, but I just don't know that they could be so incompetent as to think that the exact location where the virus was in his brain would be where you would try to do a lobotomy. I felt like that was a way to get him out of the way, kind of like he's a
Oh, yeah.
witness, so we got to
I
make him
think it
unable to
was I
communicate.
think it was probably a bit of both, definitely.
Because they rushed him in when they realized he understood English and knew that it was all a cover up about the virus. They were like, oh, we got to do it now. And that all, I mean, I don't know. They just went back and forth between malevolence and incompetence. And the fact that they
Yeah.
were like having a cookout while they were doing the tests on him was also disturbing. I mean, it was just there was no organization, no control, no safety other than what they did themselves. I thought it was telling at the end that he let the family just fight the monster with no outside help at all, because even though that's not how it happened in real life, I don't think it totally showed up the incompetence of the people in charge because their gas, their basically mustard gas or whatever it was, didn't work. And so they just let this family do that. I mean, there was no help at all. And I think it just ranged from like actual malevolence, like, and there's not caring, to like just incompetence, but then not wanting to admit it.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And there was a lot of that just kind of scene. I noticed watching it through this time where that scene in particular where he's been caught after he's broken quarantine the first time, the first time, and they've caught him and brought him back, and they're trying to do like run tests on him or whatever. And first they can't get the antidote to like take hold of him on him, and they can't figure out like why he's not out when they're gonna do like a biopsy or take some, I don't know what they were doing. It looked painful, but they were doing some testing on him and the anesthesia never took. And I was always really curious watching that scene because I thought, do they want to torture him to silence him, or are they just that incompetent when they're doing it? Which again, that makes me question when they did the lobotomy, essentially what they were doing when they went in and basically drilled a hole in his head. You know, were they trying to, I mean, yes, they wanted to silence him, but were they also still trying to get the virus at that point as well? And they're just going about it in a really incompetent way. At the same time, I also noticed that, you know, like you, I noticed that people were standing outside just having a cookout, but then also like they're supposed to be in a quarantined, you know, set up hospital, like military type setup, and that all the doctors and nurses are running around, you know, mask pulled down, not covering their face, they're not wearing the proper protective gear, and they only put that on when certain people walk in. You
Yeah,
know,
I
like,
noticed that
oh, our
too.
superiors are in, we've got to redress. So yeah, it was just really interesting because I was sitting there watching it and I was thinking, okay, the first time I saw it, I just assumed it was their incompetence because so much of this movie is kind of skewering that, like that kind of operational level incompetence. But then I was also thinking, well, maybe they're not concerned because they know at this point the virus. So there's no point in doing it if nobody's looking.
Yeah,
So
and one of the characters, I can't. Oh, go ahead.
oh no, I just couldn't figure it out. I'm curious to hear your take.
I'm in the same boat. I'm not sure either. And I'm not even sure if we're supposed to know because I think that's part of like just the existential horror of their situation is that there is no necessary answer. It's just I don't know. I don't know. I don't want to use the word crazy, but it's chaos. It's just chaos, I think would be the way to put it. I was under the impression that them not wearing their mask correctly was because they knew there was no virus, but I'm not, like you said, it's not clear because the American who shows up at that point acts like they don't know there's no virus. But who knows? Nobody knows who knows what. Nobody knows who knows what, and they don't know what they should know. Like, it's very just disorganized and chaotic. But I can't remember if it's the brother, the sister, the Archer, the college graduate who notes when they're in a hospital, if we're in quarantine, why are we the only ones wearing masks? You know, like why aren't the doctors? So they're already kind of suspicious of what's going on. And one thing I just want to say before I pitch it back to you is that the only thing that the powers that be seemed able to do correctly was put a bounty on the heads of these poor family members who are just trying to get this girl. Like that's the only, they were good enough to get the printouts of their pictures to hang up everywhere and have a bounty, and they could catch the father. But other than that, it was just complete chaos. Well, and I guess too, you know, the one family member goes to a friend to get help and he sells them out to get the bounty. It's almost like nobody in the family, like nobody in this film has like empathy or connection except for the family. It's just chaos all around them.
Yeah.
Even the protests against like the gassing of the city are disorganized because at first they're in the wrong place.
Yeah.
I don't know. It makes
Yeah.
me very sad for humanity and like
Well,
our
you know, like I
general way of
said,
being.
this movie isn't exactly like a subtle one. It comes to like kind of what he is, you know, shining a light on, because like his friend who I couldn't tell if his friend that he goes to who eventually sells him out, or at least thinks about it, when he's looking at like or asking like if the reward money is going to be taxed, he makes a point to tell him that yeah, he has a job with a good salary, but he's in, you know, tens of thousands of dollars of credit card debt. So yeah, there's this feeling that everybody in the movie is in a position that isn't sustainable, you know, because we have this working class family that's at the center of it, the Parks, um, and they're struggling in all sorts of different ways. Then you have, I guess, like his friend who works in the fancy office building who sells them out. Clearly, is kind of working this like, I don't know, that was almost like a capitalist type. You can never win. Like you're just going to kind of work your whole life and can never really get ahead because he can't even afford the life that he has. And then there's the family, the two brothers, I guess, that we meet towards the end, who the little brother ends up in the monster's lair and actually ends up being adopted by the Park family after by the end of the movie. And they're presented as these kind of homeless children who go around basically stealing what they can. They're like scavenging to live their life. I don't know. So yeah, you're right. Like nobody in this movie really has it figured out. I guess that's not the phrase I'm looking for, but it's not like there's an ideal place to be here. And have you seen Parasite?
No, I
Okay.
haven't. No.
All right. Well, then I will not say what I was going to say. Um, I was going to say it reminds me a lot of things that he does later in Parasite that I feel like kind of the groundwork was set. Well, in some of his other films too, because Snowpiercer deals with a lot of the same thing. But yeah, I mean, I don't know who, like, I don't know, everybody is victimized in a different way. I would say maybe the only people who are the true like villains and monsters are definitely every American in this film.
Yeah.
And possibly like the government and the like institutions like the media and the medical system that goes along with it. Because I mean, I think there's definitely enough to support in this movie that there was never an illness to begin with, and that all of that is just a cover up to like not let people know that there's a giant like walking fish attacking people down by the river. So it's just
Yeah.
easier to put up a quarantine and tell people to mask up,
Right.
and
Stay
not admit
home.
that
Yeah.
there's, a nightmarish walking fish. Because I guess that's the closest thing to it, right? Is that it's supposed to be some sort of fish with a lizard tail and dinosaur feet.
Yeah, the monster, I thought, okay, I'm gonna say, I thought the monster was cool, especially when it would swing around on things and it was hanging from its tail. It was scary. But at the same time, there were moments where it was almost kind of, I don't know, like it was almost too much. And I'm sure that was probably even intended because of the comedy horror that was going on. But yeah, it's like a giant catfish with front legs and a prehensile tail, and then random legs that don't do anything sticking out of its back. And then it had like the monster from Stranger Things mouth. And
The monster from Stranger Things mouth, yes.
And then that sounds like laughable and bizarre, and it kind of like was, but it was also terrifying. And I don't know how they did that, but I
Yes.
also just kind of liked watching it jump around. And when I think it was most terrifying when it was swimming or eating somebody. Also, the idea that it threw up all the time sounds silly, but was effectively horrifying as well.
Oh man,
That was so
yes.
gross.
Yeah, because usually it would just wrap its tail around its victims, and like if it wasn't going to eat them right away and drag them back, sometimes it would swallow its victims and then like regurgitate them whole if it didn't want to eat them. But then in one of the grosser scenes I've seen in any kaiju movie, it was when it vomited up all the bones.
Yeah.
And that was, again, it's the comedy budding with the horror that I noticed in that scene too, which kind of made it worse to watch. Because like first it vomited up a skull and you're like, oh, okay, obviously it can't like digest bones, which makes sense, right? And then it vomits again and like more bones come out and you're like, okay, yeah, that's what's happening. But it like keeps happening. Like it happens for, I feel like maybe 30 seconds too long.
Yeah, it just
And
keeps and coming and coming.
it
Yeah.
does. And that was one of those scenes that I was like, oh man. But again, that's one of the reasons why I love this this as like a giant creature movie. Is I was just like, oh, okay. Because I feel like that's the way comedy functions, right? Is it's like if you take something and repeat it and you're like, oh, that's funny. And then if somebody keeps repeating it, it starts getting like, you're like, okay, I thought it was funny the first couple of times. And it starts to get to that like uncomfortable place. And if they keep repeating it, it almost becomes funny again. And I feel like this is the like horror version of that. You're watching it and it happens and you're shocked and you're like, okay, I'm figuring this out as it's happening. But it just keeps going and until it like circles completely around to something even more horrific. So, but at the same time, you're kind of chuckling because there's nothing else to do other than you're like, I'm watching a giant catfish monster vomit up human bones.
I have to say, I know we've already talked about the beginning and how it shows up faster than any other monster movie I can think of. I also thought the way, and this is not a ding on other monster movies because I know there are other ones that I respect for how they show the relationship between the monster and the people, totally. But when this monster first shows up on the scene, I could totally see in real life, I could completely see this. People, like, they had their, even though it was 2006, I think one person actually had like a camera out or maybe a phone with the rudimentary thing, camera thing. And they were like, staring at it. And then it comes off the bridge and it's coming near them. And like, there's more and more people coming toward it and they're throwing things at it. Like, I would hope that I would run away, but then, but there was the human curiosity of like, oh, look at this weird thing. It's obviously not going to be good. Like it's so huge and gross looking, and they're just like taunting it. And then even when it's running, I thought the chaos that it was sowing when it was running was pretty realistic, because you had the dog attacking its owner because it couldn't get away from it. It was like the people's panic seemed real, but then it also showed people who had who were listening to music and didn't hear the monster until it ran over them, and like people running over each other and people seeking shelter and getting killed anyway, and people just standing because like, come on, if you see a giant catfish with a Stranger Things monster's mouth and two legs and the prehensile tail running at you, your brain isn't going to say like, there's a monster going to kill me, right? It's like so surreal and bizarre. And I think you could actually see that happening in people's heads. And I felt like that was an interesting portrayal. Like when you get the big Godzillas, like unless you've got the person's perspective looking up, you don't get that. But because this monster wasn't that big, I feel like you really got that like, holy crap, this shouldn't be happening, can it? Like, and then by the time you figure it out, you're eaten.
Yeah.
And that seemed, even though parts of it were comedic, that seemed realistic to me, that some creepy pollution monster can be chasing. Because like, think about it, if we're in a park like sitting there and you see something coming, you're gonna sit there too long, right? Because you're gonna be like, what is that? Like staring at it, trying to figure out what's going on. I thought that was done really well, and the idea of panic, and then it's like the one dude does try to help other people, but for the most part it's just like everybody for themselves, like total panic. And I think sadly that is like the disintegration of society, and nobody having any true answers might actually be realistic as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. I love that scene where the creature really starts to attack, because I had the same thought you did. It did feel very realistic, and it felt very terrifying in a way that I think other kaiju movies have not felt to me before. Maybe because I'm so used to, like you said, the visuals of like something stomping, into a big city, and it's just going to stomp and walk through, and, people are going to run and scream from it, but it's just kind of stomping through. And also kind of talking about that, a lot of the kaiju movies that we have talked about, like especially the Godzillas and that like kind of direct tradition from Godzilla, you got this sense that the monsters didn't necessarily want to harm anybody. And in fact, this is discussed in some of the films. They don't want to harm anybody, but sometimes they do.
Right.
Right? Because sometimes like people just get in their way. Like with Godzilla, it's like, well, we woke him up, and so normally he wouldn't be stomping around right now, but now he is. And it's not that he necessarily wants to hurt anybody. He's just, he's getting tangled up in in power lines in the city and tripping around. And same thing, we talked about that when we talked about Mothra, about how Mothra never would have been called out and into the city if the little pixie twins had not been taken. That it was only their song that called Mothra. And so Mothra was there as a rescuer and as a protector, but also in some way seeking vengeance for that. So there was always this sense that if humans hadn't messed with things, then there wouldn't have been so much destruction. And that is still here in this movie, absolutely. Humans are to blame for what happens in this movie. But also, like the creature itself, the creature is not accidentally like, oops, I took the wrong step. And because Colossal dealt with that too, right? Mm-hmm. When Anne Hathaway's character, when she realizes what's happening, she doesn't want to accidentally like step on anybody, or she doesn't want to, when she trips and falls, she feels terrible because she knows she caused death and destruction. But this creature, I mean, it's it wants to eat people. Like it's not there's no like, oh, I accidentally took a step and took out, a city. It's I want to eat and I want to grab things that I can eat later and I want to make I want to stock my pantry with humans. And so number one, there's that, right? There was the sense that this thing is hunting us and that there was no safety. It may not be as big as like a Godzilla, but I remember the scene where the people run into that like trailer or whatever that's there.
Yes.
And it just goes in and like shuts the door behind it. And you kind of hear the like screams and you see the bloody hands coming out of the locked door. And it's terrifying because there was this sense of, no, this thing is hunting us. And
Hmm.
then at the same time, there was just an unabashed evil running through the people who were supposed to protect us. Like in the other kaiju films, there's maybe like a good scientist and a bad scientist who are arguing over what to do. What is the ethical thing to do? The military is, trying to figure out what's the ethical thing to do. How do we protect our people? None of that is happening here. It's like the government, the medical community, the media, they all get together right away to conspire. It's like, okay, how do we best get our story straight so that we can pretend we didn't accidentally create a monster and we didn't accidentally let it eat a bunch of people? And, how do we make these people who saw it, how do we discredit them as quickly as we can? Or shut them up as quickly as we can. It was just that was, I think, the thing that makes this movie stand out to me. It's maybe it is darker. It's probably a lot darker in tone, which is why I'm glad that it's balanced a little bit with some of the other things that are going on in the movie. But like, I don't know. There's just so much evil in this movie. Like the people are evil trying to stop the Park family. The monster is evil. Like the monster wants to eat everybody and hunt everybody. And really it's just, a family and a little girl that they're trying to protect. And they don't even end up protecting her.
Right, right. Yeah, I definitely think when you talk about her, but one thing I wanted to respond to what you're saying, I agreed with everything you're saying. And when I was watching the movie, what some of that reminded me of is when we watched the Summer of Disaster, whatever that was. I think it was last year, the actual disaster year. Um, a lot of the later disaster movies, like especially the 90s and early 2000 ones, the government and the people in charge were pretty much like evil, remember? Like the
Yeah.
one, like the president realized the government was evil, and so he like sacrifices himself to save people because he realizes what he did was wrong. There was always some shady like government or military industrial or scientific thing. Like, I mean, there was a hero trying to fight against it, tell people the truth. But that's what it reminded me of, because I remember we talked about the disaster movies kind of range from, oh, there's a weather disaster and we thought we built this survivable thing and we didn't. But then there was also that kind of like corrupt person somewhere, and that got stronger and stronger as the movies went on, and we left like the mid 20th century and went closer to the 21st century. And I'm not saying that's an influence on this, but that's what I was thinking of. I'm like, this is like the ultimate darker and more monstrous version of that, it felt like to me. And I thought it was interesting that Americans were part of that force, because it doesn't, thinking about one of the articles you suggested we read talked about the similarities between host and parasite and even the titles. And it's interesting, this is called The Host, because I mean, I wasn't sure how that worked really, but if you think about it, like you were saying, is these like codependent parasitic relationships between all the levels of society, like that also plays a role in the corruption and the kind of the survival aspects, in a way that I think you could do with other things other than a monster, but the monster focuses that.
Yes. No, I completely agree with that. Yeah, because it does make you question like why something like this is called The Host when there's really not an illness that it's the host of. which is what you think it is when you look at the title
Right.
to begin with.
Right. I think they even
Um,
say that when they talk about the virus, like the monster is a host for the virus or something to that effect, like really fast. It goes
yeah,
by so quickly. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. That it is the way. Yeah, yeah. I know. I completely agree with that reading. Well, should we talk about the little? I know we're running long. I feel like we should talk about the little girl since she's at the center of it.
I think we do need to talk about Hyun. So I loved her character so much. Like she is probably the most heroic and altruistic person in this whole movie. And her whole, just like we said in that introductory quote, that her birth was an accident, so was her death. And like you said earlier, it's like we're pulling the whole time for her to be rescued, and she's not. And that was like ripping my heart out of my chest, like gut punch right there, because she did it. She and the little homeless child, the Seju, survived, and she did everything she could to protect him and take care of him. And she had great ideas for getting out. I mean, man, when she has to try to climb the creature to get to that rope, and then the creature, again, visceral, predatory, it plays with her. It plays with its food like a cat, which was so creepy, because she runs up its body and grabs the rope thing that she made, and it just takes his tail, pulls her off the rope, and sets her down. And then when she tries to run away, it catches her. And that just tore me up. Her lifeless body there at the end. The whole point of the movie is to try to rescue her, and she doesn't make it. I mean, I was so glad the little boy made it, because that was kind of her legacy. And then he adopts her and raises her, adopts the boy and takes care of him. But she was. I mean, the family was great, but like she was, I don't know. I mean, she felt like the heart of the movie to me, and to have her, it makes sense, I guess, that she wouldn't make it because it would be difficult to make it, but it still hurt. She didn't make it.
Yeah, I agree. And, I feel like, again, that was, probably, again, it's not a subtle movie. I feel like it's worth saying again, because she's the best part of this movie. She's, and I mean that in the sense that she is, like you said, she's a great character. She's, clearly she's smart. Everything that she does when she is taken to try to get herself rescued is amazing. The fact that she, calls, she manages to hide even once she's there, in the monster's lair. She manages to hide. She finds a little spot that she can hide in. She manages to call on her cell phone and connect with her dad. When that doesn't work, she's going to try something else. She makes it one line really made me laugh, which was when a new body was deposited. She just said, please let him have a working cell phone. So she's very, very clever when it comes to things like that. Just the fact that she was able to rope and try to get herself out, and get take care of the little boy and get him out. um all of it. She's very smart. She's funny. She's just a joy, like, to watch on the screen. And I'm like you, just the fact that she didn't make it is heartbreaking, but also feels like kind of the point of the film too, because she represents everything that, like, society has failed, right?
Right.
She's supposed to be what, she's everything good, right? So society should be, like, protecting her. At the very least, they need to be protecting her. And it it can't, you know. The police are not going to find her. The government, the military is not going to be able to fight this monster to help her. People have given up on her almost immediately. And then her family, try as they might, they fail. And of course, you could say, well, the social system is what set them up to fail in their mission, which of course is true. But it's still heartbreaking. And I did like that she had the little boy, and that he did survive, and that he's you know, like you said, he is kind of her legacy because she worked so hard to keep him safe. And also, I think with her father in particular, you get the sense that the little boy, he's like taking care of himself as a little boy. So he, in that way, it's kind of a happy ending because he's able to give him like a family that he never had growing up. But yeah, it's heartbreaking that that's what happens with her in the end. Very fitting for what the movie was, but heartbreaking. And I agree, she was absolutely the very best part of this movie.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's like the system failed her, basically. I thought the end of the movie was interesting. I thought it ended really well, and just like the rest of the movie, with confusion and fear and no positivity. I mean, yes, the father is taking care of the little boy, and I agree with you that he's kind of part of his healing by taking care of him, and that's great. And the little boy has a family. But the end I thought was interesting because he's back in the snack trailer or snack shack that the family ran, and he's running it because the father dies during the course of the movie fighting with the monster and the grandfather of the little girl. And he's sitting there watching the ice because it's wintertime, and he thinks he sees something under the ice, and so he picks up a shotgun. And so this idea of lingering trauma is there, that the feeling that anything could happen, like it could happen again, like there's another one basically out there. And he realizes there's nothing there, or at least he thinks there's nothing there, and so he puts the gun down, and he goes to wake up the kid to eat dinner, because remember the kid talked about all the things he wanted to eat because he was starving, because he was homeless. And so he fixes the dinner, and they got the news on in the background, and basically it shows you can't hear precisely what they're saying because the two characters are talking over it about how they don't want to be watching this, and they're trying to turn it off, because the kid says we need to just ignore it and enjoy our dinner. And while it's happening, there's apparently a Senate investigation in the US about what happened, and they're just talking about how it was incompetence and misinformation and blah blah blah. But there's no sign that anything is actually going to be, there's no indication that anything could be or will be fixed. It's just a bunch of political talking. Like, it's just as incompetent and confusing and chaotic as the whole rest of the movie. Like, there's the idea that this could easily happen again, and that they're probably going to spin a new narrative to try to discredit what people maybe thought that they saw happen before. And so you kind of end up with, they're happy and they're warm and they're eating food and there's this great relationship, but there's a possibility that something like this could happen again, and there's still no net, there's still no help or understanding.
Yeah. Yeah. The ending where he's just sitting there watching everything, and they turn off the TV, like they make a point of turning off the TV, and just, I think the little boy says, why don't we turn it off and just focus on our food? Yeah, there is this sense that nothing really is changing. And again, I think that's what makes this, yeah, a really kind of terrifying movie, is there were no lessons learned really at all. And like the evil that was there and that was so rampant is still existing. Like whether or not there's another monster coming, the evil that was there is still just going. So, I guess we're glad that the remaining members of the Park family are still alive and well, and apparently have somewhat of a happy ending. Yeah, not much has changed. I still love this movie. I will also say, because this is just a little fun thing that I read, and I think I had heard about this before and forgot about it, but apparently while they were making this movie, they named the creature Steve Buscemi after the actor. So there's just a little, as you think about, walking catfish with giant monster mouths, you can just think in your head, Steve Buscemi. Well, I guess that's it for our discussion of The Host. I really enjoyed it. I only wish that Matt was here. If you guys can or have watched this movie, we'd love to hear your thoughts. As always, you can reach out to us. We're across social media at No Fear Cast on Twitter and Instagram. We also have a Facebook page. Our email is nofearcast@gmail.com. If you love what we're doing, consider supporting us on Patreon. You'll get exclusive access to extra content over there. Those are always a lot of fun. Or you can simply rate and review us, which is entirely free for you, but it does help other listeners find us. The music is by Nicholas Gasparini. Thanks for listening. We'll be back in 2 weeks with a brand new episode.